keep going. Build where no one is watching. Strengthen where no one is measuring. Advance where no one is keeping score. This isn't humility. It's the most powerful principle Stoicism teaches, and the most ignored one. Because we live in a world that confuses visibility with progress, that treats exposure as proof of growth, that taught you to believe that what isn't seen doesn't count. The Stoics disagreed, and the way they disagreed changes everything. Epictetus said that whoever lives to please others becomes a slave to many masters, not as provocation, as diagnosis, because there's a form of slavery that uses no chains, no force, no threat. It uses approval, and it works better than any chain, because the person carries the prison inside themselves. Pay attention to this. There's a difference that seems subtle, but changes your entire life. One thing is to act. Another thing is to perform. Acting comes from a value, from a clear judgment, from a decision that keeps existing even when no one is watching. Performing comes from expectation, from impact, from the need to be seen in motion. The two can look the same for a few days, but when the silence comes, when the praise doesn't arrive, when no one reacts, only one continues. The other stops, not because talent was missing, because it was never sustained by the right source. You decide to change your routine, your body, your discipline, your way of reacting, and before the change even has structure, you announce it. You tell someone. You go looking for validation. You go looking for the feeling that now it counts. And that's exactly where your strength starts leaking out. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire under constant pressure. Wars, conflicts, betrayals, losses, responsibilities that would crush most people. And what he wrote to himself wasn't spectacle. It wasn't material for applause. It was internal training. It was a way of reinforcing the command center of the mind before the noise of the world hijacked his judgment. Do it because it's right, not because it will be seen. That wasn't performative humility. It was mental survival strategy. Because the moment action starts depending on someone else's gaze, control over your own life has been handed to people who have no commitment to your path. The Stoic life, steady, quiet, solid, begins when you understand this, not when you stop caring about others, but when you stop needing them to move. Hold on to this, because what comes next explains why this cycle is harder to break than it looks, and why the difficulty has nothing to do with weakness of character. There's a real reason why staying silent takes real effort. Stoicism identified the symptom with precision. The mind that seeks approval is a divided mind. Part acts, part watches to see if the action is being noticed, and a divided mind doesn't sustain anything long enough. Behavioral science lines up with this. Talking about yourself activates the same reward system in the brain that responds to real achievements. The nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, doesn't distinguish between accomplishing and announcing. To it, both deliver the same signal, the same release, the same feeling that something was achieved. The act of announcing already delivers part of the reward that was supposed to come from the result. And when the reward arrives before the action, the drive to act weakens. Not because you're weak, because the system received the mission complete signal before any mission was completed. This has a practical consequence that shows up every single week in the lives of people who haven't spotted the pattern yet. The person wakes up Monday with real energy, shares the plan with someone at lunch, feels that lightness of someone on the right track, and by Thursday, the project is in the exact same place with no apparent explanation. It's not lack of discipline, it's the fuel being burned before it gets where it needs to go. When the motivation to act comes from within, from a value, from a purpose, from a conviction, it's processed in the prefrontal cortex, the command center of the mind, the region responsible for long-term planning, sustained discipline, and clear judgment. The Stoics called this region the hegemonikon, the innermost core of reason, the place from which real decisions should always come. When that motivation migrates outward to the praise, to the comment, to the validation, the processing shifts to the immediate reward system, and that system was not built for long projects. It can't sustain accumulated effort. It can't hold through days with no visible result. It doesn't survive the weeks when nothing seems to change on the surface. When it takes over, you perform well while the praise keeps coming, and you stop when it's gone. Not because you gave up, because the wrong fuel was being used from the start. Stoicism doesn't ask you to isolate yourself or stop talking to people. It asks something more precise, that you learn to separate what's worth saying from what's worth doing, that you stop confusing the relief of announcing with the progress of building. You want to study, but you announce it first. You want to train, but you post about it first. You want to fix your finances, but you bring it up first. You want to change your emotional patterns, but you need to make everything visible before it has any structure. And every time you do that, you create two pressures at once. The first is internal. Your brain gets a taste of the reward ahead of time. The second is external. You start carrying the weight of other people's expectations and interpretations on top of something that's still being born. Result? What should be simple becomes heavy. What should mature in silence starts to warp. What should grow through consistency starts to depend on a reaction. Today, it's just mentioning the plan to a friend. Tomorrow, it's explaining the career change to family. Then, it's justifying every decision to people who were never going to understand anyway. And at some point, you realize you're no longer acting from conviction. You're acting from permission. Drop it in the comments right now. 2 words. One thing you've been announcing but haven't actually started. Not for me. So you can get clear on what needs to change starting today. Hold on to this, because there's one more layer, and it's the most costly one. Chronic exposure to judgment carries a cost most people never calculate. Not because it's abstract, because it's invisible while it's happening. The brain processes social judgment as physical threat. The same system that responds to real danger responds to a criticism, to a look of disapproval, to a poorly timed joke. To the nervous system, there is no difference between being threatened by a predator and being under the constant scrutiny of people carrying resentment or comparison. Both release cortisol. Think about someone who works in an environment where every decision gets questioned, every idea becomes a target, every step needs a justification. Over time, they stop proposing, stop taking risks, stop moving forward, not because they got lazy, but because the system that should be driving action is being consumed by constant defense. This happens inside the brain in measurable ways. Chronic cortisol compromises the prefrontal cortex. Yale researchers documented how chronic stress reduces the density of neural connections in that region, weakening exactly the command center you need to think clearly, to maintain discipline, to make decisions aligned with your values. Think of a muscle under constant load with no recovery. It doesn't grow, it atrophies. It progressively loses strength with no visible sign at first, until the weight that used to feel light becomes impossible to carry. The prefrontal cortex works the same way. Chronic exposure to judgment doesn't knock you down all at once. It keeps reducing your decision-making capacity in small, imperceptible doses until the clarity you had disappears without warning, and you don't understand why. The Stoics called this the corruption of the hegemonicon. What Stoicism protected was never your public image. It was exactly that region, the internal space where real decisions are made, away from the noise, away from judgment, away from any voice that isn't your own reason. You don't weaken because of a character flaw. You weaken because you've been voluntarily administering doses of pressure to the system that was supposed to protect you. And this weakening has practical consequences you've probably already felt without being able to name them. Difficulty keeping commitments, impulsive decisions, clarity that disappears exactly when you need it most, the feeling that the version of you who acts with firmness only shows up on certain days,
and on others seems completely out of reach. That's not inconsistency of character. That's the command center operating compromised. You start to hesitate, start to second-guess everything, start thinking about how it will be perceived, start editing your life according to other people's reactions, and little by little, discipline stops being a relationship between you and your principles. It becomes a relationship between the audience. That's the hijacking. That's the diagnosis, and it's more serious than it looks, because as long as the problem has no name, it keeps doing its work. If this video showed you where your energy is being drained, subscribe now. In the next one, you'll see how to take back command before this pattern destroys what you're still trying to build.